restoring sacred sites to their former glory and adorning them with impressive new monuments had long been a reliable method for boosting Egypt's domestic prestige. However, the challenge of enhancing the nation's standing on the international stage remained. With his military background, Seti understood that global influence was rooted in military might. Yet Egypt had not secured a major victory in the Near East since the days of Amenhotep II. During the reigns of Akhenaten and Tutankhamun, attempts to defend or expand Egypt's territories in Syria had failed miserably. Horemheb had made efforts to re-establish Egyptian dominance, but with limited success. As a result, Egypt's reputation as a great power was severely weakened. Its foreign holdings were at risk of breaking away or being seized by the Hittites, and its control over vital trade routes was under threat. Swift action was necessary to protect the Ramesside legacy from slipping away. Wasting no time, Seti launched his first military campaign while still crown prince. Advancing along the Phoenician coast, he worked to reclaim Egypt's historical sphere of influence and to ensure continued access to Mediterranean ports, along with their garrisons and bustling trade centers. At the beginning of his sole reign in 1290, he led further expeditions with similar strategic goals. The first to suffer Egypt's military might were the Bedouin tribes of northern Sinai. Although conflicts among these tribes did not directly endanger Egyptian security, they jeopardized critical supply routes to Egypt's imperial possessions in Syria-Palestine. Seti understood that maintaining control over the coastal route in northern Sinai was essential for any broader military ambitions. Once Egypt's authority was reasserted at home, Seti pushed forward into Canaan, regaining key fortified cities such as Beth-Shan and Yinom. His victory was symbolically sealed when he compelled the chiefs of Lebanon to cut wood before him. In earlier eras, such localized campaigns would not have required the king's personal leadership. But Seti recognized the importance of projecting a renewed image of royal power abroad, and he was well suited for battle. However, maintaining this aggressive policy would draw Egypt deeper into the complex web of international politics, bringing far-reaching consequences. By Seti's time, the political landscape of the Near East had undergone dramatic and irreversible changes since the confident days of the late 18th dynasty. Under Thutmose IV and Amenhotep III, Egypt had established lasting peace with the northern Mesopotamian kingdom of Mitanni, cemented through a series of diplomatic marriages. For 50 years, the two powers had respected each other's spheres of influence and coexisted peacefully. But early in Akhenaten's reign, the rise of an aggressive and ambitious Hittite king shattered this carefully crafted balance. In a series of rapid and devastating campaigns, Shupaluyama, the Hittite ruler, broke out from Anatolia, seized large portions of Mitanni territory, and even plundered its capital. Egypt remained loyal to its ally, but by then, Mitanni was a declining power. A new superpower had emerged, and Egypt was caught completely off guard. During Akhenaten's reign, the initial response of the Egyptian government was to stay uninvolved. This policy of inaction proved to be a grave miscalculation. The combined weakness of Mitanni and Egypt's reluctance to intervene allowed several former vassal states to exploit the resulting power vacuum and seek greater independence. Among these, Amurru was especially prominent. Its ruler, Abu Simbel, was an opportunistic manipulator, quick to exploit political rivalries and social unrest to serve his own ambitions. His numerous letters to the Egyptian court form a significant part of the Amarna letters. Whether the Egyptians failed to fully understand his intentions or deliberately chose a policy of non-intervention remains uncertain. Regardless, this disinterest only emboldened Abu Simbel, and Amurru slipped from Egyptian control. Elsewhere, Egypt's once feared authority fared no better with the rebellious state of Kadesh. The rulers of Kadesh had posed a persistent challenge to Egypt since the days of Thutmose III, and during Akhenaten's rule, they promptly defected to the Hittites when their forces approached. A failed attempt to retake Kadesh exposed Egypt's diminishing power. Another assault during Tutankhamun's reign met the same fate, encouraging the Hittites to further strengthen their grip on northern Syria. Aziru of Amuru, Abi assured his son, recognizing the shifting balance of power, aligned himself with Kadesh and pledged loyalty to the rising Hittite empire. In a desperate bid to avoid domination by the Egyptian region I, Tutankhamun's widow proposed a marriage alliance with a Hittite prince, potentially opening the door to a lasting peace. However, the mysterious death of Prince Zenanza only gave the Hittite king fresh justification for military aggression, as he retaliated by attacking Egyptian-held territories in southern Syria. Yet, fortune did not favor the Hittites completely. The prisoners taken during these punitive campaigns unknowingly carried a deadly plague back to the Hittite capital. The epidemic swept through Hattusa, claiming the lives of the king and his crown prince. The plague continued to ravage the Hittite heartland for 2 decades. To the Hittites, it must have seemed as though the gods had turned against them. To the Egyptians, these strange events far from home rekindled hopes of victory. A tense, fragile peace descended upon Syria, with Egypt and the Hittites locked in a stalemate. Such was the situation when Seti I ascended the throne. A soldier at heart, Seti was determined to restore Egypt's lost prestige. After 50 years of humiliating retreat, it was time for Ammonius Ra to lead his people forward once more. Having reasserted Egyptian authority over Phoenicia and Canaan, Seti turned his focus to Amuru and Kadesh. Reclaiming these territories would deal a symbolic blow to Hittite ambitions and greatly enhance Egypt's standing in the region. Only a year after securing Bethshan and Yinom, Seti's forces advanced deep into central Syria. Kadesh fell, and the victorious Pharaoh commemorated his success with a grand inscription in the city. But the triumph was fleeting. No sooner had the Egyptian army departed than the treacherous inhabitants of Kadesh returned to Hittite allegiance. In contrast, Seti's campaign in Amuru achieved lasting results. Once brought back under Egyptian control, Amuru remained loyal. By the end of the campaign, a significant part of central Syria had switched allegiance. Seti had wiped away the shame of earlier defeats and set Egypt once again on the road to imperial dominance. In reality, the Hittites were far from defeated. They regrouped, rallying their formidable forces on the Anatolian plateau, preparing for full-scale war. As tensions mounted, the long-anticipated confrontation between the two great powers was drawing ever closer. Beneath the apparent determination and confidence of Seti I's foreign policy lies a troubling paradox. If, as later accounts suggest, Egypt and the Hittites had reached some form of understanding during Horemheb's reign, then Seti's daring military campaigns completely disregarded that arrangement. His actions ignited a chain of increasingly violent confrontations that ultimately failed to restore Egypt's dominance, instead leading to long-term setbacks. In hindsight, Seti's military ventures in Asia appear reckless and misguided. One possible reason for this course of action may have been political convenience, rather than a carefully thought-out assessment of Egypt's true strategic needs. Throughout history, rulers have often provoked foreign conflicts to divert attention from domestic troubles. Indeed, certain clues from the early years of Seti's reign suggest possible instability within his own administration. Notably, on the battle reliefs at Ipitsut, an enigmatic figure identified simply as the group marshal and fan-bearer Mehi appears with unusual prominence, suggesting a significant role in both the military campaigns and Seti's broader offensive agenda. For Mehi to be depicted with such distinction on a royal monument, he must have been one of the most powerful figures at court. Some have even proposed that Mehi was designated as Seti's successor, following the precedent of military officers rising to the throne. However, Seti's young son, Prince Ramesses, had other plans. Within a few short years of Mehi's depiction being carved, every image of him was systematically removed from the Ipitsut reliefs, replaced by images of Ramesses himself. The next generation of the Ramesside dynasty was determined not to allow a commoner to wield such influence over Egypt's affairs. Only Ramesses would be remembered by history as his father's true heir and most loyal supporter. Only Ramesses would continue Seti's ambitious foreign policy and lead Egypt toward imperial glory. Only Ramesses would directly confront the Hittites in a decisive battle for supremacy on the world stage. With the pharaoh's army preparing for war, the nation marched resolutely toward its next great conflict. On a crisp May morning in 1274, shortly after sunrise, Ramesses II broke camp and led his army forward. In the cool morning air, the immense force of more than 20,000 men slowly descended from their ridgetop campsite, winding their way down the dusty trail into the valley below. After a month-long march, their final destination lay just a few hours ahead. For centuries, the city of Kadesh had been a major player in Near Eastern power struggles. Located in the fertile Orontes River Valley, it controlled one of the few strategic passes connecting inland Syria to the Mediterranean coast. Its position made it a critical prize for any power-seeking dominance over the region. In Thutmose III's time, Kadesh's prince had led the rebels defeated at Megiddo. More recently, Kadesh had adeptly played both Egypt and the Hittites against each other, shifting alliances whenever it served their interests. Its rulers had also taken extensive precautions to fortify their city. While they were willing to incite conflict between the rival empires, they had no intention of seeing their city destroyed in the process. Nestled at the junction of the Orontes and one of its tributaries, Kadesh was naturally protected on three sides by water. By digging a channel to connect the two rivers on the southern side, they had effectively transformed the heavily fortified city into an island fortress, virtually impervious to attack. Nevertheless, Ramesses was determined to capture Kadesh and restore Egypt's prestige in Syria. After a decade of sporadic conflict, both the Egyptians and Hittites agreed that Kadesh would serve as the stage for a decisive battle to determine control over Amurru. With determination and anticipation, the Egyptian army advanced toward its objective. Ramesses had assembled a massive force, likely representing 3/4 of Egypt's military strength. Organized into 4 divisions, each led by a senior royal officer, the king personally commanded the lead division, named after the god Ammonius. Following behind were the divisions of Ra, Ta, and Seth. Once on the move, the long line of soldiers stretched for more than a mile, their weapons gleaming in the morning sun. As the son and heir of the warrior king Seti I, Ramesses had learned the art of leadership firsthand. The sight of him riding triumphantly in his golden chariot inspired his troops and struck fear into the hearts of his enemies. Early reports from the field suggested that the Hittites had been intimidated. As the division of Ammonius advanced through dense woods on the southern bank of the Orontes, Egyptian scouts captured 2 Bedouin tribesmen. Under questioning, they delivered astonishing news. The Hittite army, overwhelmed by Ramesses' strength, was retreating and currently camped 120 miles away in Aleppo. Suspicious of possible deceit, the Egyptians interrogated the captives further, but the Bedouins maintained their story. Encouraged by these reports, the Egyptian army confidently pressed on toward Kadesh. Emerging from the forest, the division of Ammonius crossed the Orontes near the village of Shabtuna. After another 3 hours of marching, they reached their campsite opposite Kadesh. The location was ideal, with a nearby stream offering much-needed water for both men and horses. While the animals drank, the soldiers quickly set up camp, parking chariots, erecting tents, and positioning shields into a protective formation. By 3 p.m., the sprawling fortress of Kadesh loomed faintly on the southeastern horizon. Upon arrival, Ramesses' scouts immediately fanned out to survey the surroundings and gather intelligence on enemy movements. They soon encountered 2 Hittite spies conducting similar reconnaissance. Fortune favored the Egyptians once again that afternoon. The captured spies were subjected not to gentle questioning, but to severe beatings. Under torture, they revealed shocking information. The Hittite king Immortality II and his forces were not far away, but camped directly behind Kadesh, hidden from view by the town's mound. Moreover, the Hittite army was not retreating, but preparing to launch a surprise attack on the Egyptians at any moment. After revealing their shocking information, the captured spies were brought before a stunned Ramesses. Overcome with rage, the pharaoh lashed out at his senior officers for their incompetence. Taking full control of the unfolding crisis, he issued immediate emergency orders. The royal princes who had accompanied him were quickly evacuated westward, away from the impending assault. The vizier was dispatched south at full speed to hasten the advance of the division of Ta, which was still preparing to cross the Orontes. Ramesses's desperate message was clear. His Majesty is all alone. Moments later, the Hittite attack began. A formidable force of 2,500 chariots, manned by warriors clad in long mail coats, surged across the river and struck the division of Ra as it advanced north toward the Egyptian camp. Unlike the Egyptian chariots, designed as swift mobile platforms for archers, the Hittite chariots were solid and heavily armed, built for shock combat. Each carried a crew of 3 armed with spears for close-quarters fighting. When deployed en masse, these chariots were devastating against enemy infantry, as the division of Ra quickly learned to its great cost. The battlefield was soon littered with Egyptian dead and wounded. The survivors, panicked and disorganized, fled toward their camp with the Hittites close behind. The enemy quickly reached the Egyptian camp, breaking through the still unfinished shield wall and charging directly into the command tents. Chaos erupted. With no time for deliberation, Ramesses sprang into action, leaping onto his chariot and throwing himself into battle against the attackers. At his side stood his elite bodyguard of Aegean mercenaries, fierce warriors from the western fringes of the Hittite world whose bravery had earned them reputations as formidable soldiers for hire throughout the Near East. These men, not the Nubians of earlier times, were now the preferred foreign recruits of Egypt's army. Together, they fought fiercely as Ramesses maneuvered his chariot through the turmoil, unleashing a hail of arrows at the enemy while maintaining the defense amid the mayhem. Despite their efforts, the situation appeared dire, and it seemed only a miracle could save them. That miracle arrived, though it was not divine intervention, but a result of careful planning. While the main Egyptian force had marched overland to Kadesh, a reserve unit of elite troops had been dispatched by sea, sailing along the Phoenician coast. Their mission was to land at the port of Sumer and march inland via the Eleutheris Valley, modern Nahr el-Kabir, to rendezvous with Ramesses at Kadesh on the day of his arrival. The plan worked flawlessly. Just as the battle reached its critical moment, the reinforcements appeared on the horizon in a cloud of dust. Reinvigorated by the arrival of these elite charioteers, the Egyptians regrouped and launched a counterattack. The Hittites were pushed back, forcing a retreat toward the Orontes. As the enemy fell into the river, many drowned or were swept away by the current, while others narrowly escaped to the opposite bank. The Prince of Aleppo, one of Muwatalli's leading commanders, was dragged from the bloody waters by his men, barely clinging to life. What had begun as a surprise assault by the Hittites had now backfired. In a matter of minutes, what seemed to be a certain victory for Muwatalli had turned into a humiliating defeat. As evening fell, the Egyptian division of Ta finally arrived, just in time to capture the remaining Hittite soldiers, count the enemy dead, and gather the spoils abandoned on the battlefield. The surviving Egyptian troops staggered back to their camp, soon followed by the 4th and final division, Seth. Both sides now paused to assess the toll of the fierce engagement. For Egypt, the heavy casualties on the battlefield were compounded by a serious blow to its military reputation. The army had come perilously close to destruction, and it was only the king's personal courage, combined with the timely arrival of reinforcements, that had averted total disaster. The Hittites, too, faced a grim aftermath. King Muwatalli had lost 2 of his own brothers in the fighting, along with his secretary, the chief of his personal guard, for elite charioteers and many officers. With neither side achieving a clear victory, the Battle of Kadesh remained unresolved. At dawn, after a restless night spent treating the wounded and repairing damaged chariots, the 2 armies faced each other again on the plain outside Kadesh, prepared for the long-anticipated battle. But the previous day's bloodshed had left both forces critically weakened. The Egyptians, having lost many men, could not overcome the fresh and determined Hittite infantry, which had remained unengaged during the initial assault. The Hittites, meanwhile, had lost much of their chariot force and were unable to deliver a decisive blow. After hours of brutal combat with no breakthrough, Ramesses finally ordered his troops to retreat from the field. He recognized that capturing Kadesh was no longer possible. Mu'attali, likewise, saw that victory was out of reach. He offered terms for peace and sent an envoy to the Egyptian camp to negotiate a ceasefire. Ramesses, with little choice, agreed. Just 24 hours after arriving at Kadesh, the Egyptians gathered their equipment and began their march home. After 2 long months away, Ramesses's once mighty army returned to the Nile Delta in late June, weary and demoralized. Yet Ramesses himself seemed to draw confidence from the hard-fought encounter, particularly from his own actions that had spared Egypt from disaster. Though he had not secured a decisive victory, he had salvaged survival from near defeat, reinforcing his belief in his destiny. True to his grandiose nature, Ramesses transformed the Kadesh campaign into a personal triumph. Through a well-coordinated propaganda effort combining literature and visual art, the pharaoh spread his version of events throughout Egypt. Court writers were commissioned to produce both a factual prose account and a stirring epic poem celebrating the king's great victory over the Hittites. These texts were carved into temple walls and undoubtedly performed repeatedly at court to reinforce the message. To accompany these literary works, Ramesses ordered his artists to create a standardized series of dramatic battle scenes. Central to these images was the king himself, depicted heroically defending the camp single-handedly against waves of attackers. So pleased was Ramesses with these portrayals that he had the same set of scenes engraved on the facades of at least 5 major temples. Together, the poems and images not only glorified his bravery, but also highlighted the failings of his senior commanders, contrasting their hesitation with his own decisiveness under fire. For a king whose throne may once have been threatened by rivals within the military elite, this was a deeply satisfying form of vindication. For modern historians, these extensive texts and images provide an unparalleled wealth of information, making the Battle of Kadesh the best documented military engagement of the ancient world. For Ramesses's contemporaries, however, these grandiose accounts signal the dramatic return to the ostentatious and boastful monarchy of earlier times. After the heresy of Akhenaten, the brief reigns of his immediate successors, and the military rule of Horemheb and the early Ramesside kings, a flamboyant and triumphant kingship had returned in full force. Although the stalemate at Kadesh failed to achieve Ramesses II's strategic ambitions, the truce that followed offered him an unexpected benefit: the opportunity to channel resources away from costly foreign campaigns and into grand domestic projects. During the first 20 years of his reign, Ramesses embarked on an ambitious program of temple construction that spanned his empire, from the Lebanese port of Kebni in the north to Gebel Barkal Deep in Sudan. His particular focus on Nubia was evident, as he commissioned shrines at 7 different sites in the region under Egyptian control. Within Egypt itself, his architects and builders undertook major expansions of the great national temples at Heracleopolis, Abydos, and Thebes. Today, no other pharaoh has left behind as many surviving monuments bearing their name as Ramesses II. Through both new constructions and the deliberate appropriation of earlier structures, Ramesses guaranteed his legacy would endure for eternity. His drive appeared fueled by an intense desire to surpass all who came before him, coupled with an unwavering belief in his own singular importance. One of his favorite personal myths recounted how the 7 Hathors had gathered around his cradle as an infant, foretelling an extraordinary destiny for him from birth. Whether this reveals extreme self-absorption or an underlying insecurity remains a matter of speculation. What is certain is that his building projects prioritize scale and power over subtlety or grace. Only in the richly decorated tomb he commissioned for his beloved queen, Nefertari, at Thebes, did he allow his craftsmen the freedom to fully express their artistic talents. Even Egypt's impressive quarries struggled to meet the enormous demand for stone required by his simultaneous construction efforts. As a solution, Ramesses resorted to dismantling the monuments of earlier rulers and repurposing their materials for his own projects. Among the most significant casualties of this plundering were the temples erected by Akhenaten at Thebes and Akhetaten. The small, uniform stone blocks that had allowed Akhenaten to build so quickly also made his monuments easy to dismantle. Thousands of these blocks were stripped from the Aten temples to build new shrines honoring Egypt's traditional gods. In this way, Ramesses simultaneously purged the remnants of Akhenaten's religious revolution and promoted himself as the guardian of the old faith. Since the reign of Amenhotep III, nearly a century earlier, Luxor Temple had been the ceremonial heart of divine kingship, its grand colonnade hall and elegant courtyard providing a majestic setting for the annual Opet festival. Ramesses could not resist the chance to enhance it further. He added a new forecourt and an enormous gateway, which he decorated with monumental reliefs celebrating his so-called victory at Kadesh. Unafraid to modify the work of his predecessors, he even altered the temple's main axis to better align it with Ipit-Sut, creating a more unified processional path. To complete the redesigned facade, Ramesses installed what became his signature feature, colossal seated statues of himself, accompanied by towering obelisks. In the end, grandeur and spectacle seemed to be his ultimate goals. Nowhere is Ramesses's flair for spectacle and self-glorification more vividly displayed than at the temple of Ramesses' beloved Ammonius, known today as Abu Simbel in Lower Nubia. The sheer rock face of a sacred mountain rising above the Nile near the Second Cataract served as the setting for his most extraordinary and audacious creation. The smaller of the two temples was dedicated to Hathor, the mother goddess and protector of royalty. Inside, a relief shows the goddess emerging from the primordial papyrus marshes, cradling the king in her embrace. Outside, however, piety gives way to ostentation, with the decoration focusing on Queen Nefertari and her devoted husband. Flanking the temple entrance are statues of Nefertari, each accompanied by towering 30-foot figures of Ramesses himself. The larger temple elevates this theme further, dominated both inside and out by the king's likeness. Its facade features 4 colossal seated statues of Ramesses, each nearly 70 feet tall. Beneath them, rows of foreign captives are carved beneath the king's name, symbolizing his domination over all peoples. Inside, the walls depict Ramesses slaughtering Egypt's enemies and presenting them to the gods. At Abu Simbel, far from the heart of Egypt, Ramesses's self-deification reaches its zenith, unchecked by tradition or restraint. The full extent of his self-aggrandizement becomes clearest in the temple's innermost sanctuary. Beyond a grand pillared hall and past numerous depictions of the Battle of Kadesh, lies the sacred chamber carved into the heart of the mountain. Here sit statues of Egypt's 4 chief gods, Ptah of Memphis, Ammonius of Thebes, Horikti the solar deity, and the deified Ramesses himself, placed among them as an equal. Twice a year, on February 21st and November 21st, the rising sun pierces the temple entrance, illuminating the sanctuary and bathing the divine statues in light. The spectacle must have been awe-inspiring. Following Abu Simbel, Ipit-Sut, and Luxor, Ramesses's most ambitious construction was his mortuary temple at Thebes on the Nile's west bank. Known as Ramesses United with Thebes, or the Ramesseum, it was the most monumental complex of its kind since Amenhotep III. Every part of the temple was devoted to glorifying the king through inscriptions, statues, and reliefs. After passing through the massive gateway, adorned with scenes from Kadesh, visitors entered the first courtyard lined with colossal statues of Ramesses along its northern side. Opposite them stood a balcony from which the king could address his subjects during festivals and public ceremonies. Beyond a second gateway, also carved with battle scenes, lay a second courtyard, again dominated by enormous statues of the king. Beside this gateway, once stood a massive granite colossus. The broken fragments still bear the king's throne name, Usermatra, which later inspired the name Ozymandias, immortalized in the famous poem about the transience of power. The Ramesseum, perhaps more than any of his other projects, reflected Ramesses's unparalleled status, not only spiritually, but economically. The surrounding storerooms and granaries could hold 350 boatloads of grain, enough to sustain a city like Thebes for an entire year. In effect, the Ramesseum functioned as Upper Egypt's reserve treasury. The king's control of such immense resources allowed him to pursue his obsession with grand monuments, from the towering statues of Abu Simbel to the vast courts of Thebes. It is fitting that Shelley's famous lines echo Ramesses's legacy. "My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair." Not satisfied with constructing temples and appropriating monuments across Egypt, Ramesses II embarked on an even more ambitious architectural enterprise. His father, Seti I, had once built a modest summer palace near the old Hyksos capital of Hutweret, the ancestral home of the Ramesside dynasty. As a young man, Ramesses likely trained for war there. Upon becoming king, he transformed the site into something far grander. Over 20 years of continuous construction, an expansive complex of palaces, halls, government offices, and military barracks emerged, eventually forming a new dynastic capital that rivaled Memphis and Thebes in magnificence. With characteristic boldness, he named it Per-Ramesses. It was a residence worthy of royalty, boasting extensive living quarters and administrative zones packed with palaces, temples, and public buildings. The surrounding region was among Egypt's most fertile, providing fruit, vegetables, wine, and grazing lands for vast herds of cattle. Scribes wrote glowingly of its canals filled with fish, marshes teeming with birds, lush pastures, and overflowing granaries of barley and wheat. The royal district, spanning 4 square miles, was naturally fortified by canals and sandy ridges along the Nile. Court poets extolled the splendor of Ramesses's palaces, describing grand pillared halls adorned with dazzling tilework. Walls, floors, and columns shimmered with colorful designs depicting rivers, gardens, royal symbols, and foreign captives. Even the steps leading up to the throne bore images of vanquished enemies, so the king might trample them with every ascent. Beyond the royal palace, the elite neighborhoods were equally opulent. The wealthiest citizens lived in grand villas with private canals and lush water gardens, creating a scene reminiscent of Venice. At the city's heart stood a massive temple dedicated to the divine trinity of Amenhotep, fronted by 4 colossal statues of Ramesses himself, rivaling the grandeur of Ipit-Sut. The 4 corners of the city were protected symbolically by shrines to other important deities. In the south, a temple to Seth, god of Hutweret. In the north, a sanctuary for Wadjet, the cobra goddess of the Delta. In the west, a temple honoring Ammonius of Thebes. And in the east, a shrine for Astarte, the Syrian goddess of love and war, who had been absorbed into the Egyptian pantheon and assigned the role of protecting the king's chariot horses. Per-Ramesses was a cosmopolitan city, even by New Kingdom standards. In addition to its foreign deity shrines, the city hosted foreign embassies and entire districts for mercenary soldiers from abroad. Merchants from across the eastern Mediterranean crowded its markets and docks. With its close proximity to Palestine, it likely attracted waves of immigrants seeking opportunity. Pithom, Per-Adam, is identified with modern Tel el-Maskuda, just a day's travel from Per-Ramesses, while Ramses unmistakably refers to this very dynastic capital. It is highly probable that Semitic-speaking laborers were involved in building the city. As for the Exodus itself, Egyptian records are silent, suggesting the biblical account may weave together multiple historical threads. Yet, as we've seen, Ramesses was never one to let facts obstruct his preferred narrative. While court poets celebrated Per-Ramesses as a joyful royal residence, there was a more ominous side to this grand project. One of the largest structures housed a sprawling bronze-smelting factory where hundreds of laborers worked in intense heat, forging weapons for the king's army. High-temperature furnaces, fueled by blast pipes and bellows, produced molten metal that was cast into shields and swords. In these grueling, dangerous workshops, Egypt's military power was forged. Elsewhere, vast stables, training grounds, and workshops serviced the king's elite chariot corps. The royal stables housed at least 460 horses, cared for by teams of grooms and trainers, while nearby arenas allowed for their exercise and equipment maintenance. In truth, Per-Ramesses was as much a military-industrial complex as it was a royal pleasure palace. Its very creation had been driven by rising conflict in the Near East. From this city, Ramesses had departed for the Battle of Kadesh and returned. Despite its grandeur and prosperity, Per-Ramesses stood as a constant reminder of the king's unfinished struggle in Syria-Palestine. Even with the region's most powerful chariot force at his command, Ramesses had not eliminated the Hittite threat. Yet as he brooded in his riverside palace, frustrated by his stalled ambitions, little could he have known that events far beyond Egypt's borders were about to shift in his favor. The inconclusive outcome at Kadesh had led to a decade-long Cold War, with Egypt and the Hittites locked in a tense standoff, neither side able to claim dominance. However, these long-standing rivals were no longer the only contenders for power in the region. Across the Euphrates, Assyria was rising. Less than a year after the Battle of Kadesh, emboldened by the Hittites' failure to secure victory, the Assyrians struck. They attacked Hanagalbat and turned it into their vassal. It was a clear warning that neither the Hittites nor the Egyptians could afford to dismiss. Determined to reaffirm Egypt's influence, Ramesses launched a series of minor campaigns in the Near East. His goals were threefold: to reinforce Egyptian authority over its vassal territories, to quash opportunistic revolts that had erupted in the wake of Kadesh, and to send a clear signal to the Assyrians that Egypt remained a formidable power. Having suppressed insurgents in the hills of Galilee and recaptured the key port city of Akko, Ramesses's confidence swelled. He boldly advanced into Amurru. One by one, city-states succumbed to the Pharaoh's advancing forces, and before long, Ramesses controlled the central Orontes Valley, effectively splitting the Hittites' southern territories in two. His audacious move threatened to ignite a full-scale war, but fate intervened. The sudden death of the Hittite king Muwatalli triggered a political crisis. The throne passed to his young son, Prince Urhi-Teshup, who became king. But within the royal family, power struggles brewed. Hattusili, Muwatalli's brother, had ambitions of his own. Soon, the Hittite court fractured into rival factions. After a bitter internal conflict, Hattusili seized the throne, forcing Urhi-Teshup to flee. Observing these events from afar, Ramesses could scarcely believe his fortune. After years of competing with the Hittites for supremacy, fate had unexpectedly delivered him the perfect bargaining chip. As soon as Urhi-Teshup arrived in Egypt, Hattusili demanded his extradition. Ramesses refused, placing his forces in Syria on high alert to deter any potential Hittite retaliation. Yet his instincts told him an attack was unlikely. A new king had risen in Assyria, driven by imperial ambition. Ramesses correctly judged that the Hittites, facing this looming eastern threat, would be too preoccupied to risk another conflict with Egypt. When Assyria invaded Hanagalbat again, erasing it as an independent entity, the Hittites suddenly found themselves even more vulnerable. The Euphrates now stood as their last barrier against the aggressive expansion of Assyria. Confronted with a far greater danger, Hattusili and his kingdom had little choice but to prioritize national security over old rivalries and wounded pride. An alliance with Assyria was out of the question, so Hattusili cautiously reached out to Egypt, testing the possibility of a peaceful resolution with Ramesses. After a year marked by delicate negotiations and extensive diplomatic exchanges, the terms of an agreement were finally settled. Thus, in early December 1259, nearly 15 years after the Battle of Kadesh, a distinguished delegation departed from Hattusa, headed for Per-Ramesses. Accompanying the Hittite envoys was a representative from Carchemish, the Hittite stronghold on the Euphrates, signaling that fostering amicable relations with Egypt had become central to Hittite foreign and security policy. After a month-long journey across the dusty roads of the Near East, The delegation reached the Grand Delta city and was escorted into Ramesses's royal audience chamber. Bowing deeply before the pharaoh, the chief Hittite envoy presented a large silver tablet, inscribed with cuneiform script. This gift from Hattusili contained a replica of the comprehensive treaty that would henceforth bind Egypt and the Hittite kingdom in mutual alliance and friendship. Determined not to be outdone, Ramesses had the Egyptian version of the agreement carved into the walls of Seti, ensuring an enduring testament to his diplomatic prowess. The document itself was extraordinary, regardless of which language it was written in. After formally ending hostilities between the two great powers, the treaty declared the establishment of friendly relations. Behold, Hattusili, ruler of the Hittites, enters into a treaty with Usermatra, chosen of Ra, the great king of Egypt, beginning this day, so that perfect peace and brotherhood may exist between us forever. He in brotherhood and peace with me, and I in brotherhood and peace with him, for all time. The provisions of the treaty were comprehensive and visionary. It included a mutual non-aggression pact, a defensive alliance, an extradition agreement, with assurances of humane treatment for those returned, an amnesty for refugees, and a crucial clause protecting the royal succession and the rights of each monarchy. With Ur-Teshub, the deposed Hittite prince, still living under Egyptian protection, this last stipulation was essential for Hattusili, as it secured his rule and the future of his dynasty. It also aligned with Ramesses's own dynastic ambitions, evident in his unprecedented move to elevate many of his sons to prominent positions. In this way, both nations preserved their dignity and each could claim success. Egypt reluctantly relinquished its aspirations to reclaim Amuru, but retained control of its remaining Asiatic territory, UPE, and secured trading rights along the Lebanese and Syrian coasts, extending as far as Ugarit, modern-day Ras Shamra. With the signing of this accord, the Near East experienced a level of peace not witnessed since the days of the Egypt-Mitanni alliance under Amenhotep III. From bitter foes to close allies, Hattusili and Ramesses marked the dramatic shift in their relations through a cordial exchange of letters. Even their wives joined in this diplomatic warmth, with Ramesses's principal queen, Nefertari, sending lavish gifts of jewelry and fine garments to her counterpart in Hattusa, affectionately calling her sister. The only lingering issue was the continued asylum Egypt granted to Ur-Teshub, but Hattusili chose not to let this mar the growing friendship between their kingdoms. As relations flourished, discussions soon turned to the prospect of a dynastic marriage. For Hattusili and his equally determined wife Padukapa, offering their daughter in marriage to the powerful pharaoh of Egypt would cement ties between the two royal houses and strengthen their political position. Ramesses, securely established on his throne, was primarily attracted by the immense dowry accompanying the Hittite princess. Already content with his beloved Egyptian queen, he showed little personal interest in the union itself, treating the arrangement more as a political and financial transaction than a romantic alliance. The Hittite princess, regardless of her personal feelings, had no choice but to obey. In the late autumn of 1246, she departed from the fortified palace of Hattusa, accompanied by a large entourage of dignitaries and an enormous caravan loaded with gold, silver, bronze, livestock, slaves, horses, and other riches. The procession traveled slowly, first crossing the rugged Taurus Mountains, then descending into the coastal plains of southern Anatolia. They continued over the Amanus Mountains, down into the Aleppo Plain, and followed the Orontes River southward, passing by Kadesh and finally reaching the frontier of Egyptian-controlled lands. At the border, Queen Padukapa bid her daughter farewell for the final time. A messenger was sent ahead to inform the pharaoh, "They have crossed high mountains and dangerous passes to reach your majesty's border." Ramesses promptly dispatched military escorts and court officials to receive the procession and accompany it safely through Canaan. Their final stop before entering Egypt was a purpose-built royal residence along the Sinai coastal road, offering the princess and her retinue a place to rest and recover from their arduous journey. The palace's richly decorated rooms, adorned with colorful floral murals and gold leaf, offered a glimpse of the luxuries that awaited her. In February 1245, after 3 months of travel, the caravan finally arrived in the resplendent city of Per-Ramesses to jubilant celebrations. After receiving the generous dowry, Ramesses bestowed upon his new bride a grand Egyptian name, Methornefra, meaning she sees in Horus the beauty of Ra. Without much fanfare, he then assigned her to one of his harem palaces. Several years later, the princess's brother, Crown Prince Hishmishama, made a state visit to Egypt, spending the winter in the milder climate of the eastern delta. For a prince raised among Hittite stone citadels, the vivid and extravagant architecture of Per-Ramesses must have left a powerful impression. Indeed, when he eventually assumed the Hittite throne, Hishmishama decorated his kingdom's sanctuaries with monumental religious art on a scale surpassing that of his predecessors. Even a Hittite, it seemed, could not resist Egypt's artistic grandeur. The prince's visit may have been intended as a prelude to an even more significant meeting. A burst of diplomatic correspondence between their capitals discussed the logistics of such an encounter, and Ramesses expressed his desire that he and Hattusili might finally see each other face to face. The friendship between Egypt and the Hittite kingdom had reached unprecedented strength and would endure until the eventual fall of the Hittite Empire. Throughout his lengthy reign of 67 years, Ramesses II remained deeply committed to protecting Egypt's imperial holdings in the Near East and keeping the Hittite threat at bay. Simultaneously, his security forces kept a close watch on emerging danger from a different direction. The semi-nomadic tribes of the Libyan desert, along with their settled relatives along the coast, have been a persistent nuisance since Egypt's earliest dynasties. In the past, a few military campaigns had been sufficient to deter them and prevent significant incursions into the western delta. But circumstances had shifted. Although little is known about Libya's early history and archaeology prior to the arrival of the Phoenicians in the 8th century BC, Egyptian texts indicate that by the Ramesside era, a sophisticated civilization had developed along the North African coastline. Trade connections with the Mycenaeans brought imported goods and prosperity to the Libyan coast. These new resources enriched local leaders, providing them with wealth and influence previously unknown. Years of service as mercenaries in Egypt's army had also taught the Libyans valuable lessons in modern warfare. They adopted chariot warfare and developed considerable expertise in archery. By the latter part of Ramesses II's reign, the Libyan tribal chiefs had amassed both the wealth and military capability to pose a serious challenge to Egyptian power. In response, Ramesses ordered the fortification of Egypt's entire western frontier. His defensive network consisted of a chain of imposing fortresses spaced approximately 50 miles apart along the length of the western delta. Each stronghold was positioned within a day's chariot ride of its neighbors, and only a few days' ride from Per-Ramesses itself. These fortresses not only guarded the coastal approaches, but also secured the region's key wells, cutting off access to water for any invading force. One of the larger fortifications even housed its own temple, intended to inspire courage in its defenders. True to Ramesses's character, this temple was dedicated to his own divine cult. For a time, the pharaoh's western wall effectively kept the Libyans at bay. They failed to breach the defensive line during his lifetime. However, after Ramesses's death, the unexpected rise of his 13th son, Marinta presented the Libyans with a new opportunity. In 1209, during the 5th year of Marinta's reign, word reached the pharaoh. The vile leader of the Libyan enemies, Mary, son of Didi, has advanced. The cunning enemy had prepared well. Forming a web of strategic alliances, he orchestrated a simultaneous uprising in Nubia to divert Egypt's southern forces, while reinforcing his own Libyan army with a sizable contingent of mercenaries from the Aegean and beyond. These sea peoples introduced a completely new form of warfare, relying on heavily armored infantry equipped with short-range weapons, small round shields, and protective body armor. Their tightly packed ranks of well-equipped soldiers rendered Egypt's traditional chariotry virtually useless. Like the Libyans, many of these sea peoples had previously served as mercenaries in the Egyptian army. Indeed, Aegean troops had formed part of Ramesses II's personal guard at Kadesh, giving them valuable knowledge of Egypt's military strengths and weaknesses. Mary's strategy was simple but shrewd: divide and conquer. By launching attacks on multiple fronts at once, he aimed to throw the Egyptians into disarray, disrupt their communication lines, and create an opening for victory. He first dispatched a small raiding force along the coast to keep Egypt's border garrisons preoccupied, while the main army advanced through the western desert oases, Siwa, Bahia, and Farafra. The latter controlled several desert routes connecting to the Nile Valley at various points, allowing Mary to keep the Egyptians guessing about his next move. Once he was certain that the Nubian diversion was underway, he advanced on Egypt in a coordinated pincer movement designed to block any organized counterattack. Leading his primary force from Farafra back to Bahia and then to the Fayum, he entered the Nile Valley near the pyramids of Dashur, moving northward to the outskirts of the western delta. Meanwhile, a secondary detachment split off at Bahariya, crossing the Nile in Middle Egypt to infiltrate the eastern delta, drawing attention away from Per-Ramesses and Memphis. Barely a month after receiving the first reports of the invasion, Pharaoh Marinta mobilized his army and confronted the enemy near Perer. It was midsummer 1208. Just as his father Ramesses had faced his greatest trial in the 5th year of his rule, so now Marinta found himself tested in the same year of his own reign. But this time, Egypt would not leave the outcome to chance. If the Libyans and sea peoples had studied Egyptian tactics, the Egyptians had done the same. Marinta knew that his chariots and archers could not easily break through dense infantry formations head-on. Instead, he lured the enemy forward into his lines, while archers positioned on both flanks unleashed relentless volleys of arrows, sweeping across the advancing soldiers. After 6 brutal hours of slaughter, the Libyan coalition collapsed. At that point, the Egyptian chariots charged, turning a hard-fought victory into a full-scale rout. The fleeing enemy was hunted down, leaving few survivors. The spoils of war were immense. Thousands of metal vessels, livestock, and advanced weaponry fell into Egyptian hands. To further reinforce his triumph and deliver a chilling message to future adversaries, Marinta ordered a horrific display of psychological warfare. The surviving Libyans soon came to envy their fallen comrades at Perer, as they were rounded up and impaled alive on stakes. By the end of the day, rows of fly-ridden corpses lined the main desert road south of Memphis, their entrails rotting in the oppressive heat, visible to any retreating Libyans and to the local population alike. It was a brutal warning, yet even such a savage display could not guarantee Egypt's safety for long. Marinta understood that the Libyans would strike again. He also recognized the constant threat posed by their allies, the sea peoples, who could arrive unexpectedly from nearly any direction. In response, he devised a broader strategic approach, reinforcing Ugarit, sending shipments of grain to support the Hittites' northern defenses, and even incorporating Hittite infantry into his own army. These foreign soldiers were equipped with their own specialized weaponry, produced in the bronze workshops of Per-Ramesses. The hostilities of Kadesh were now a distant memory. In the unstable new world of the eastern Mediterranean, Egypt needed every ally it could secure. Ironically, the commemorative inscription Marinta ordered to celebrate his second victory over the Libyans is not remembered for its details of the battle or for its accounts of Egypt's defensive efforts. Instead, it is renowned for a single, brief reference in its penultimate line. After routing the Western invaders, Marinta's army marched directly across the delta into Palestine, retaking the crucial cities of Ashkelon, Gezer, and Yinom. To further stabilize this critical buffer zone, his forces then attacked and annihilated a previously unrecorded rebel group inhabiting the hill country of Canaan. This group called itself Israel. It is the only mention of Israel in any known ancient Egyptian text, and signals the emergence of militarized tribes that, while unable to challenge Egypt in open warfare, nonetheless posed a growing threat to regional stability. In truth, Israel should have been a headline rather than an afterthought. The entire Near East was undergoing profound upheaval. Long-standing powers were weakening, new groups and states were rising, and evolving military tactics were shifting the balance of power. Despite its proud military traditions and its lineage of warrior pharaohs, Egypt now faced a future marked by uncertainty. In an absolute monarchy, a lengthy reign could be both a blessing and a curse. While too many rapid changes on the throne risked undermining the divine authority of kingship and destabilizing the government, an extended rule carried its own perils. Ramesses II's extraordinary 67-year reign brought both benefits and complications to Egypt's administration. On the positive side, his resolve and personal magnetism succeeded in restoring Egypt's status as a dominant imperial power, and the numerous monuments he commissioned stood as symbols of revived confidence and prosperity. On the negative side, Ramesses's remarkable longevity, combined with his prolific offspring, planted the seeds for serious succession disputes in the years that followed. Although Marenta, as the eldest surviving son, inherited the throne without much contest, and his reign remained relatively stable, trouble erupted soon after his death. The passing of Marenta unleashed a flood of royal grandchildren who considered themselves rightful heirs to the throne. Ramesses II had sought to reinstate dynastic stability after the chaos of the post-Akhenaten period by breaking long-standing traditions and granting powerful governmental roles to his many sons. As a result, these sons grew accustomed to holding significant power, with the throne appearing to them as a legitimate prize. Predictably, a fierce succession crisis unfolded following Marenta's death in 1204, as two rival contenders vied for the crown. One was Seti I, Marenta's eldest son and designated heir. Opposing him was Amenmess, another grandson of Ramesses II. Despite the tradition of primogeniture favoring Seti Marenta, it was Amenmess who initially gained control. With strong allies in high office, and possibly military backing as well, Amenmess seized power and ruled for 4 years, while Seti Marenta languished in distant exile within one of the royal residences, powerless within his own kingdom. Yet Amenmess' grip on power would not last indefinitely. Eventually, the balance shifted, allowing Seti Marenta to reclaim his rightful position as King Seti II. Once restored, he immediately launched a sweeping purge. High-ranking officials who had served under Amenmess were swiftly stripped of their positions, including the vizier and the high priest of Ammonius. Having supported the wrong side, they paid dearly for their allegiance. The purge spread throughout the government, temporarily crippling the administration as Seti eliminated anyone suspected of sympathizing with his rival. Amenmess himself received no clemency despite being Seti's first cousin. His name was systematically erased from all monuments and inscriptions. Statues and temple reliefs bearing Amenmess' name were defaced, with Seti's name carved in their place. Since the preservation of one's name was essential for eternal life, its destruction meant complete obliteration. For an Egyptian, there was no more dreadful fate. Like his father Marenta before him, Seti II was already advanced in age when he ascended to the throne, fully aware that his time to leave a lasting legacy was limited. Eager to make his mark, he set his workforce of quarrymen, masons, and architects into a frenzy of activity, determined to contribute to the sacred landscape of Thebes. On the east bank, at Ipit-Sut, builders began constructing a modest 3-chambered chapel to house the sacred bark shrines of Ammonius, Mut, and Khonsu. Although diminutive compared to the grand hypostyle halls of Seti I and Ramesses II, it was still a monument. Across the Nile, the Valley of the Kings bustled with unprecedented urgency. The laborers toiled simultaneously on 3 separate tombs. With no increase in manpower, the relentless pace placed enormous strain on the workforce. The valley echoed constantly with the clatter of chisels and the shouts of exhausted workmen, resulting in craftsmanship that fell well below the standards of previous generations. Seti's race against time was lost after only 2 years on the throne. Like his father and grandfather, he passed into the afterlife to join his royal ancestors. His intended successor, another Seti I, was either deceased or unable to assert his claim. In his place, and with the support of Chancellor Bey, the crown fell to a sickly young prince afflicted with a withered left leg. Though hardly an inspiring figure, the youth was malleable and of royal blood. This new king, Seti I, was in fact the surviving son of Ramesses, Seti II's former rival. During Seti II's brief rule, Bey had expertly played the role of loyal lieutenant, rising from the position of royal scribe to chancellor. He even earned the rare privilege of a tomb within the royal necropolis. Yet, before Seti II's body was even interred, Bey shifted his allegiance, backing the fragile son of his former enemy. His betrayal was profound. Boasting publicly that he had established the king on his father's seat, Bey's true motivation was self-interest, securing his own power and influence. Because Seti was still a minor, a regency was formed to govern on his behalf. For appearance's sake, the regency was led by Seti II's widow, Tawisret, but Bey exercised the real authority from behind the scenes. In the 5th year of Seti I's reign, 1193, Tawisret made her move. As Hatshepsut had done centuries earlier, she adopted full royal titles and rallied her allies within the court to overthrow Bey. His fall was swift and absolute. Accused of treason, Bey was executed, and his name was officially erased from records, denying him immortality. Official references to him reduced him to the great enemy, or derisively, the upstart from Syria. The following year, Seti himself died under convenient circumstances. With her enemies eliminated, Tawisret unleashed a systematic purge of his memory. His names were chiseled out from his tomb and from her own, replaced with those of her deceased husband, Seti II. In this way, the descendants of Marinta ultimately secured their triumph. But this victory came at a steep price. Egypt had endured more than a decade of internal strife among the descendants of Ramesses II. The nation was destabilized by an endless cycle of coups, counter-coups, purges, and reprisals. Governmental functions were paralyzed, leaving the state effectively powerless. No male heir remained to continue the royal line. Instead, the throne was held by a vengeful widow. Less than 20 years after Marinta's resounding triumph at Per, Egypt had descended into chaos, with responsibility for the nation's decline lying squarely with the ruling dynasty. What Egypt needed was sweeping reform. Egypt had faced such crises before. The turmoil that followed Tutankhamun's death, though now beyond living memory, offered a recent precedent. Then, as now, the solution had been to turn to the military. And so, once more, the power brokers of Thebes and Memphis looked to the army for a leader. The man they chose was perfectly suited, an experienced army commander in charge of the garrison troops, trained for leadership and capable of seizing power. With a son already serving in the military, he also offered the prospect of dynastic continuity. Even his name, Sethnacht, seemed predestined. Sethnacht rose to the occasion. In 1190, he mobilized his forces, crushed all opposition, and restored order within months. His swift military coup left no enemies standing. To reinforce his position, Sethnacht unleashed a propaganda campaign to complement his military success. On a victory stela at Abu, Egypt's traditional southern boundary, he painted a bleak portrait of the nation-state before his intervention. Egypt had been in ruins and had lost its divine favor. He further accused unnamed Egyptian authorities of plotting with Asiatic outsiders to seize control, exploiting Egypt's deep-seated fear and distrust of foreigners. In doing so, Sethnacht cast himself not as a usurper, but as Egypt's savior, divinely chosen above millions, ahead of countless others. Following the example of Horemheb, Sethnacht erased his immediate predecessors from the historical record, presenting himself as the legitimate successor of Seti II. It was a carefully orchestrated manipulation of history. Although already advanced in years, Sethnacht had no need to worry about securing his legacy. His son and heir, fittingly named Ramesses, would ensure the continuity of his line. When Ramesses III ascended the throne in 1187, he deliberately modeled himself after his illustrious predecessor Ramesses II, adopting the same names and royal titles as the victor of Kadesh. He even gave his own sons the same names and roles at court as Ramesses II's children. Construction commenced on a grand mortuary temple at western Thebes, echoing the design of the Ramesseum. For both officials and ordinary Egyptians, it must have felt like a revival. History, however, was about to repeat itself.